Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. I want to start off this review by saying a huge thanks to Burson Audio, who once again have been kind enough to send me one of the first ever production units of their brand new, in this case, DAC amp all-in-one unit. I say in this case because previously they were kind enough to send me the amazing Burson Soloist 3X GT, that's their top of the range headphone amp, and if you've seen that review you'll know how much I loved it. So I was really excited to try the Conductor 3X GT, which as I said is their DAC and headphone amp all in one device. So I'm excited to tell you all about it shortly, but before I do, I just want to point out that I've got some fantastic content coming down the pipeline. I've got a video with 3 great dongles, including the Moondrop Moon River 2 and also the Quest Style M15. I'm looking forward to that one. I've also got the amazing Rode NTH 100 headphones and a battle between 2 digital to digital converters or USB bridges to see first of all if they're worth using and secondly which one's better should you choose to. So there's some fantastic content coming. I'm having lots of fun putting the reviews together because they're really interesting products. And I say this to make sure that you've got a chance to subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to catch those reviews. Or if you want to see what else is in the pipeline, you can join me on Patreon and see the entire review schedule as it comes up. Ask me specific questions about the products to include in the reviews or to answer before the review, all that good stuff. So check out Patreon if that's of interest. But for now, let's get on with reviewing the Burson Conductor 3X GT. The Conductor 3X GT, or the Conductor GT as I'm likely to start calling it, now takes the place as Burson Audio's top-of-the-range DAC. It uses a pair of ESS 9038 DAC chips, and those are paired up with some of Burson Audio's proprietary power management systems, and then sending out the audio through a discrete output stage using Burson's own V6 Vivid op amps. If all of that means absolutely nothing to you, what you need to know is it's got serious amplification potential, both in terms of quality and power, and that's paired up with an excellent power supply and a couple of state-of-the-art DAC chips. The end result is a fully featured DAC that's going to handle everything up to DSD 512 and PCM to 768 kHz, which basically means any format you can throw at it, and then it can output 8 watts into 32 ohms or 640 milliwatts into 300 ohms. And obviously there's other specs as well. You can check out the website for specific power at specific impedances. But the point is, it's got buckets and buckets of power. Now, if you heard me say 640 milliwatts into 300 ohms, and that doesn't sound like much because it's less than a watt, it's worth pointing out that if you've got a pair of Sennheiser HD800s, or maybe a pair of ZMF Atriums or Verites, any of those 300 ohm cans require just 20 milliwatts, often less, to reach dangerous listening levels. And so having 640 milliwatts on tap at 300 ohms gives you an idea of just how much power there is available. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing, as I'll talk about later. A couple of other things that I want to mention before I give you a tour of the unit is that just like the Soloist GT, if you've seen my review of that one, that's their dedicated amplifier in this same tier of products. Just like the Soloist GT, the Conductor here has a fan built in. You can probably see that through the grill there. That's an active cooling fan. It's a high quality Noctua fan. It's the same thing that's used in computers, but it's running, I believe, at less than full speed. And the chassis's been custom built to not pick up any vibrations, and therefore it runs almost silently. In my Soloist GT review, I did talk about the noise levels. I even did a recording, if I remember correctly, of the volume levels. And back then I said that it's not a particularly loud sound, and it disappears the moment you put music on. What I didn't know at the time was that Burson was still further improving the devices. The unit I had for that review was a pre-production unit, and since then Burson have made some significant improvements to the Soloist GT and now the Conductor GT as well. Specifically, I think the fan might be even quieter than it was in the pre-production unit. It's a slightly different model of fan, still from Noctua. But on top of that, there were a few interface issues that I had with the Soloist GT, and those have been completely resolved in the production units of the Soloist GT and again in the Conductor GT. And specifically what I'm talking about is the fact that when you're using the selector wheel, it's no longer touchy like it it was in that pre-production unit, so you can select what you want very precisely without risk of overshooting it when you say press in the button to make the selection. Little things like that are all absolutely seamless now. Basically, Burson have taken all the things that I had an issue with in the Soloist GT, and they were all pretty minor, but they were there. They've taken all of those and they've eradicated them, making both the Soloist GT and now the Conductor GT an absolute joy to interact with. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the menu system other than to tell you that it's where you get access to things like the gain level. There's high and low. I'll talk about that in a moment. It also lets you choose the filter setting that's used by the DAC. You can choose different inputs and outputs. This has many. I'll show you those shortly. And then there's a few other things like the phase lock loop system that's being used, or at least how strong or weak that phase lock loop is to improve jitter performance. All those sorts of things, they're all in the menu and it's all pretty easy to access. A moment ago, I mentioned gain having only low and high, and I do want to touch on that briefly. You see, this is an incredibly powerful headphone amp with 8 watts into 32 ohms. It's just an insane amount of power. It's actually, in my opinion, too much. I'm not a fan of overly powered headphone amps like this, like the Soloist GT, and many others as well. But the good news is that the volume control built into the Conductor is absolutely exceptional. And the reason I say that is because with just 2 gain modes, low and high, you have complete control over the volume level you want. In low gain mode, you can use anything from IEMs all the way through to sensitive and slightly less sensitive headphones. And then if you've got something incredibly demanding like a Susvara, maybe an Abyss 1266, any of those super duper difficult headphones, you can switch over to high gain mode and have enough power available that you're comfortably humming along without even cracking 50% power. And I say all that to illustrate 2 points. First of all, there's no need for 3 gain settings from the Conductor, because low and high give you all the range you need. The second thing I want to point out is that even though it's got insane amounts of power, the volume control stepping in just 0.5 decibel increments means you've got lots and lots of control to get exactly the volume that you want. So there's no risk of overshooting and suddenly going from not loud enough to way too loud. You've got really precise control at your fingertips. So I'm a big fan of that implementation, and the interface and the usability of the Conductor GT is nothing short of fantastic. And with that said, let me take you on a quick tour of the front and the back of the device to show you what you're getting in terms of inputs, outputs, controls, etc. Starting off on the front panel, we've got a power switch over here, of course. And then below the power switch, you've got 3 different outputs. There's a 3.5mm if you're using something with a headset, for instance. You've then got a 6.3mm single-ended output and a 4-pin balanced XLR output. So all your normal connections are covered and you've got fully balanced functionality should you want it, as well as single-ended. The good news is both the single-ended output and the balanced output perform exactly on par with each other. There might be a slight difference between them because one is single-ended and therefore you've got the shared ground. That brings some changes to the sonic character sometimes, as well as the connectors themselves having their own characteristics. But ultimately the point here is that you can get excellent sound regardless of which output you use. Moving on, we've then got this lovely white clean display, which is going to show you things like the sample rate, which input you're using, which output you're using, and the volume. It then gives you access to the menu that I mentioned before, where you've got the gain control, the phase lock loop control, you've got the filter options as well. All of that sort of information is built in there. On the far side here, we've got the volume control, which is also the rotary selector knob, so you can scroll through the options by turning it and click it in to make the selections that you want. And as I mentioned, that's been much improved from the pre-production Soloist GT, so it's now an absolute joy to interact with. The final thing to mention is we've got these 4 buttons underneath the screen, and they're going to give you access to a quick selection of the inputs, the outputs, the menu itself, and the screen orientation. And I know that's something that a few people have questioned, why there is a button dedicated to screen orientation when there are so many other potentially more important things. And as I look through the options in the menu system, there weren't too many that would make sense to have in a simple toggle switch. The filter is not something that you tend to change very often. Most people are going to find one they like and stick to it. You're not likely going to be changing the phase lock system very often. And so the only one that really stood out as something you might want to change regularly is the gain. So I spoke to Burson and I said, why did you choose to make one button just for changing the orientation of the screen? So if you've got the Conductor standing in a vertical position, you can have the whole screen rotate, put the volume on top and the information down below. I asked them why they put that as the option for the button rather than something like gain. And their answer definitely makes sense. It was kind of what I figured it might have been, and that is that they didn't want people to accidentally flick from low to high gain, and I completely agree. Given the amount of power the Conductor puts out, if you had a pair of, say, IEMs in your ears or a pair of sensitive headphones on your head and you were to bump a gain button, you're in for a really nasty shock. It's probably not quite going to do damage to you or the headphones, but it's going to be very, very unpleasant. And so ultimately, I think Burson have made the right choice. Yes, it seems like a waste of real estate having a button that you're only going to use once in a blue moon, but there's really nothing else logical that I'd map to that button anyway. So I think it's completely fine and not really worth much more discussion. Looking at the back of the device now, and there is a lot to cover here. We've got a power input over on the side, and again, like the Soloist GT, this is a 24 volt unit and it requires a 5 amp power supply. Burson sent the supercharger with this one. If you're not familiar with that, it's a high quality, high frequency switch mode power supply. And as I discussed in my review of the supercharger, which is a separate video, it makes a significant difference to the sound. It does so by basically pushing any of the switching frequencies which can produce noise outside of the audible bandwidth and therefore providing a quieter power signal. So it is also worth mentioning that all of my notes, all of my listening with the Conductor GT have been done with the supercharger, so that is giving it an advantage, but you can often get the supercharger thrown in for free when Burson runs specials. So fingers crossed you can get one, and if not, I do recommend the extra purchase. Next to the power input, we've got a series of 12 volt triggers, and that means that if you're using other devices that feed from the source device, in this case the DAC, then you can trigger them to turn on and off using those 12 volt trigger leads. Just above the 12 volt trigger sockets is our USB-C input, so there's no USB-B on Burson DACs, they're all USB-C for better or worse. We've then got a Bluetooth antenna, and as you'd expect with a DAC at this level, all of the top level Bluetooth codecs are covered. We've then got optical and coaxial inputs, so optical being Toslink and SPDIF through RCA. Now I should mention at this point that I said before this DAC can handle DSD512 and PCM up to 768 kHz, but that is only through the USB-C socket. If you're running optical or coaxial, you can only get up to 192 kHz and 24-bit audio. So it's still high res, but it's not doing DSD and it's not doing the super high res PCM. I don't personally think that's a big deal, but then I don't have a lot of DSD in my library and I do use USB most of the time. What this all also means is that there's none of the more exotic connections like AES EBU or I2S. And I'm guessing that a lot of that comes down to the fact that there is a lot of real estate dedicated to the amplification power in here, rather than space for different DAC inputs. Personally, for a DAC at this level, I would have loved to see I2S, but it's not a deal breaker for me and it's just something I thought I'd mention. Having taken care of all the inputs for digital audio, what we've then got along here is a total of 4 analog inputs. You've got 2 pairs of XLR and 2 pairs of RCA, and they're all independently switchable. So you could feed all sorts of analog inputs into this if you want to, but it is worth noting something very important, and that is that this isn't designed as much as an amplifier as it is as a DAC. And because of that, all of the volume control for the conductor is handled through the DAC chips. What that means is that if you do feed an analog input into this, it's actually going to be converted essentially from analog into digital, upsampled and processed at 192 kHz, and then played back out of those DAC chips into the output stage of the conductor. Now that might sound convoluted, but that's because it was the only way for them to get the volume control on the analog inputs without having to use up extra real estate for a dedicated volume control section. In my experience, and I'll talk about sound shortly, it's absolutely not a problem at all, but it is worth mentioning that if you're feeding this with a super high quality DAC of some sort, that signal is essentially going to get reworked by the internal DAC in the conductor. And so it's a really important distinction to make. Don't think of buying this as a DAC all-in-one that's also going to be a top-end amplifier for your other excellent DAC. Yes, it can do that, but if you've already got a really, really high-quality DAC, you're probably better off buying the Soloist GT rather than the Conductor. Yes, the versatility here is great, but the purity of amplification is not on the level of the Soloist GT, as I'll talk about shortly. This is excellent, and I'll cover that too, but it's not Soloist GT level. Now, I know we're spending a long time on the back panel and the front panel so far, but I think all of this is really important to understand what the Conductor can and cannot do. And so far what we're seeing is it's got fairly basic DAC inputs. Nothing wrong with them, but there's nothing groundbreaking. We've got a set of analog inputs that are sort of compromised and sort of not compromised. I'll talk about that in the sound section. And then finally on the end here, we've got 2 different, or sort of 3 different sets of outputs. We've got XLR outputs for a balanced output. We've got a pair of stereo RCAs, and then in the middle, we've also got a sub output. And so what the Conductor GT can do, and the Soloist GT have this as well, is it can run as a preamp via balanced output, via analog output, it will feed a subwoofer, but then it can also drive a pair of headphones and a subwoofer as well. So if you've got a pair of ear speakers, for example, or if you just want to add a bit of sub bass sitting behind, say, your pair of HD800s or a similar open back headphone that's going to let a bit of that extra bass come through and of course allow you to feel it as well, then the Conductor GT can do that for you. I don't own a sub, so I haven't tested that one at this stage, but I do know that there are viewers and patrons of the channel that have tried it and really enjoyed the results. So if that's something you're interested in, the Conductor GT, just like the Soloist GT, can do that for you. And so now that we've talked about all the various inputs, the outputs, the limitations, etc., let me talk about the sound quality of all the different variations and configurations that I could think of to try with the Conductor GT. I thought for this section I'd mount the Conductor vertically so you can see what it looks like in that setup. And I should mention that this has got the red accents, which you've clearly seen already, and the red cool stand. I don't know if the red accents are permanent or a temporary thing. I'm unclear on that, but check out the Burson website if you want to know more. Talking about sound from the Conductor GT though, and I'm going to keep the general description of sound pretty short and pretty to the point. And that is that it's a very clean and detailed sounding device. This is of course running the DAC internally and the headphone amp out to different sets of headphones. I tried a whole bunch of them with this. And what I consistently heard was a very clean and detailed sound that's not at all edgy. It's very smooth, but very, very detailed. And it presents a sound with excellent width, not a huge amount of depth, which I've come to expect from Delta Sigma chip-based DACs, i.e. the Sabre chips, AKM chips, Cirrus Logic, etc. They all have a fairly consistent ability to produce a nice wide soundstage and very good image focus of individual instruments. But they really give you much depth in the soundstage in the way that, say, an R2R DAC or a Chord DAC or a Schiit multi-bit DAC might do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it depends on what you're looking for. Some people prefer the presentation of Delta Sigma because it's a very upfront, clean sound that does sound more detailed at first listen. So it's going to come down to preferences whether it's better or worse. I personally like a bit more depth in the soundstage, but I didn't find myself noticing the lack of that because everything else from the Conductor is just so good. The tonality is excellent, the sense of detail retrieval and resolution is excellent, the soundstage width and image focus, they're all really, really great. And so rather than ramble on about the sound out of context, let me put it into context with a whole bunch of comparisons for you. And keep in mind that pretty much everything I'm about to talk about has its own standalone reviews. So if you're not familiar with it or you want to understand more about the comparison, you can always go and watch those other reviews to get a good sense of how the Conductor GT is really performing. One of the first comparisons I tried was to see if the separate stack of the Composer 3XP and the Soloist 3XP, so that's down a tier from these GT models, but I was curious to see if the separates could actually outperform the all-in-one. Often when we get an all-in-one, there are compromises made to fit everything into the same chassis and use the same individual power supply. And so I was curious to see if the Soloist and Composer 3XP could match or better the GT here. And what I heard when I fired them up was a very, very similar tonality between the two different devices, the stack and the all-in-one. And that's probably coming from the fact that they're all using the V6 Vivids as their output stages. So you've essentially got the same amplification and pre-amplification going on in all the devices, and you can definitely hear that in the tonality. Where things get different though is the Conductor GT has clearly better detail retrieval. There's a sense of micro details and resolution from the Conductor GT that is a clear tier above what I'm getting from the 3XP stack. And so it immediately showed me that there's definitely some magic going on in the Conductor GT, but I wasn't yet sure if it was the DAC stage or the amplifier stage, or a bit of both of course. So I continued with more comparisons to try to find out. The next test I tried was using the Conductor GT as the amplifier for both tests. And what I mean by both tests was using the internal DAC as one device and then the Composer 3XP, so the dedicated DAC, for the other device. In other words, what I was looking to do was see if the Composer 3XP was as good of a DAC as what's built into the Conductor GT. As always, I listened to a bunch of music for these tests, but one of the tracks that came on that caught my attention was Halftime by Nas. Listening to Halftime from the GT, it was amazingly clear, well resolved, all of the sounds were wonderfully separated. Moving over to the Composer 3XP, the external DAC, and things suddenly sounded just a bit congested comparatively. The Composer 3XP is an excellent DAC, it's not a thick and congested sounding DAC, but the Conductor GT made it sound a bit that way, because it's just so resolving and so clean, but as I said before, also smooth. There's no glare, there's no edge, it's just a wonderful sounding DAC. From the Composer 3XP, I felt like the bass wasn't as tightly controlled, and the separation of the vocal from the backing track and the general sense of separation of instruments really wasn't as strong. It still wasn't bad, but the Conductor GT was clearly superior. And to be honest, I was pretty shocked at this difference. I didn't expect anywhere near that much of a leap going from the Composer to the Conductor GT. Now, it is worth mentioning at this point that, as I said before, the sound from the Composer was technically being kind of resampled and reprocessed by the DAC chips inside the Conductor, so I don't know if that double handling was having an impact on that, but based on the fact that I heard such an improvement from the Composer and the Soloist 3XP to the Conductor GT, that would suggest that to me it's a combination of both the amplification stage and the DAC stage all playing their part in the Conductor GT. And so I'll give you a summary at the end of how I think the Conductor GT sits in the overall range. But before we get there, I just want to talk about how the Conductor GT amplification circuit compares to the Soloist GT amplification circuit. And so for this test, things were pretty simple again. I was using the Conductor GT as a standalone device, and then taking the XLR out from this into the Soloist GT. So I could very quickly tell, using the same DAC for both, how close the amplification stage was in the Conductor to the Soloist GT amplification stage. And one of the tracks that I tried for this test was Mi Alma by Ozomatli, and it sounded fantastic from the Conductor GT. There was a great sense of timbre in some of the percussion, the vocals were wonderfully separate from the rest of the instruments, and everything was really cleanly defined. It was hard to imagine it getting much better in going to the Soloist GT. And yet the moment I did make that change, the Soloist GT gave me even more space. Everything was even more clearly defined, had more space around it. It didn't make a larger soundstage overall, but everything sounded more separated, and not in an incoherent way. It didn't overly pull the track apart, but what it did was gave me a better sense of each individual instrument in its own space. I also felt like the Soloist GT had just a tiny bit more authority to the sound, and that could come from any number of places. I'm assuming they've got pretty similar designed amplification stages. And so I'm going to put that down to the fact that in the Soloist GT, you've got two independent mono amplification circuits that are completely separate, and that can give some improvements. The other possibility is that the interconnects I was using, which were the Supra Sword interconnects, those might have been bringing a tiny bit of coloration to the sound. There are lots of different possibilities, but the end result was that for me, the Soloist GT is clearly the better amplifier, as it should be because it's a dedicated amp. What was impressive though was that it wasn't a huge leap. We're talking a few % better from the Soloist GT, and so the good news is that if you need an all-in-one, you're getting pretty close to the Soloist GT whilst also getting a DAC. And as I've already covered off, the DAC is also fantastic. So as an all-in-one, the Conductor GT is looking like a bit of a beast. Now before I give you two more comparisons, I just want to wrap up things with the Burson-only comparisons. And that is to say, if you're looking at amplification capability of the different devices in Burson's range, or at least the ones that I've reviewed, then I'd say the Soloist 3XP, that's the smaller size Soloist, that's not quite as strong as the Conductor GT, and I don't mean in terms of power, it is more powerful, but I'm talking about quality. I think the Conductor GT is a slightly better amp, even though it's going through that reconversion process through the DAC chip, it is a slightly better amp stage. But then if you're after the ultimate amplification experience in terms of overall quality and power coincidentally, then the Soloist GT is still clearly a step above the Conductor. It's not a huge step, but it is a step above. And then if we're just looking at the DAC side of things, the Conductor GT is clearly and easily better than the dedicated Composer 3XP. And so if you're looking for an excellent all-in-one that has a killer DAC, a killer amp, and you don't even need to use any external devices with it if you don't want to, then the Conductor 3X GT is an absolutely marvellous device. But that got me wondering just how marvellous it was. What if, for instance, you had a little bit of budget to spare, and you could buy yourself a Soloist GT as the best possible amplifier, and then maybe a cheaper DAC to go with it. Not a cheap DAC, but something that's not going to absolutely blow out your budget and double the price of, say, a Soloist GT. And so the next test I tried was to put the Soloist GT with a Schiit Bifrost 2, a DAC that I absolutely love, and see how that combo compared to the all-in-one Conductor. For this test, I was listening to Already Dead by Beck, and the Conductor 3X GT was clearly and easily extracting more information, more detail, more resolution from the track. I love the Bifrost 2, and one of the things I particularly like about it is it's able to produce a bit of layering and depth in the soundstage, and that is an area that it was better than the Conductor GT. But for me, I'd probably trade off that little bit of space for the sheer levels of detail and clarity, but smoothness that the Conductor GT was giving me. And I can't stress enough, this wasn't one of those cases where it was a Delta Sigma DAC shoving all the detail in my face and making it sound better initially, but over time becoming fatiguing. The Conductor GT is just marvellous at balancing detail and smoothness and refinement. It's really fantastic. I'm not generally a Delta Sigma fan, let alone an all-in-one fan, but this is a device I could absolutely live with as my one and only device. And coincidentally, I'm going to talk about that in the context of my other all-in-one device that I love shortly. But before we get there, I just want to clarify by saying that the Bifrost 2 Soloist GT combo was nice, but to me, it's a waste of money if you're going to buy the Soloist GT and a Bifrost 2 when you could save some money and get better overall sound from the Conductor GT. If you've got an even higher level DAC, as I'll talk about shortly, that's when the Soloist GT comes into play, but by that stage you are spending significantly more money. And that's where the Conductor GT suddenly looks like incredible value. The quality of DAC and amp that you're getting for your money is nothing short of excellent. But before I cap things off there, I want to put that statement into complete context by putting the Conductor GT up to my reference all-in-one go-to that I've continued to rave about on the channel. It's got its shortcomings, of course, as all products do, but I'm referring, of course, to the Chord Hugo TT2. The TT2 is over double the price of the Conductor GT. It offers Chord's custom FPGA decoding process for the DAC, as well as a very, very good amplification stage, done in a bit of a different way from the Conductor, but producing less power than the Conductor offers you, if that matters, and in some ways less versatility because you can't feed a signal into it, only take signals out. I'm talking analog signals, of course. So the TT2 is a DAC, headphone amp and preamp only. It won't take an incoming signal and act as an amplifier, whereas the Conductor GT can go both ways. So in some ways, on paper, the Conductor GT is the better value. It's got a few extra features, a few extra bells and whistles, but what I was really interested in was how they sounded. Are you getting a lot more performance by spending more than double the price on the TT2 compared to the Conductor GT? Now, for those familiar with the channel, you'll know that I use the TT2 with the M scaler. For this test, I bypassed the M scaler because that completely changes the budget question. So this was just the TT2 on its own up against the Conductor GT. One of the tracks I used for this was Car Hiss by My Window by The Doors, and the first thing I noticed flicking back and forth was that there's a bit of forwardness from the Conductor GT's sound, again because of that Delta Sigma design, producing a flatter overall soundstage. Now I say Delta Sigma, technically the TT2 is also using a Delta Sigma approach, that's a type of decoding in DACs, and it involves upsampling or resampling the signal. Both of them technically use that approach, but there's all sorts of custom filtering going on in the TT2 that does things a bit differently. And so what I'm referring to from the Conductor is the fact that it's the Sabre chip, the ESS chip, doing that Delta Sigma approach. That produces an overall flatter soundstage, and that comes across initially like it's giving you more detail available. But I think it's more that it's actually pushing all the details into a single plane, whereas with the Chord DACs, you tend to get a few layers. So some of the details actually sit further back in the soundstage, but they're still there, they're still available, they're just not pushed at you in the same way. Having said that, the more I listened, the only significant difference I was hearing between the TT2 and the Conductor was there was a little bit more depth in the soundstage from the TT2. Now just to get it out of the way, when you add the M scaler, this is a completely different ballgame. But if we're just talking about the TT2 on its own, things were incredibly close between them. The TT2 I feel like had a more effortless sound to it. It just had a slightly greater sense of ease. It wasn't smoother, it wasn't thicker or richer. Tonally they were pretty similar, but everything just felt a bit more relaxed from the TT2, like it was doing it easily, whereas it felt like the Conductor GT was putting a bit more effort into it. And I don't mean that from a power point of view, it was just a feeling in the music. And I'm going to put that down to the way the decoding's working in the Chord DACs, and I think it's just producing a slightly more natural and realistic timbre, and that's what's giving it a slightly more easy sounding listen. And I can't stress enough, I don't mean easy in terms of relaxed, rolled off, smooth, rich, warm, none of that stuff. Tonally they're very similar, it was just easier to listen to the TT2. And we're talking minor margins here, by a couple of percent. As I continued to listen more and more and across multiple tracks, the other thing that I started to find, and that's probably part of that easy to listen to thing as well, is that the Conductor GT does sound just a little tiny bit more congested, comparatively speaking, in the soundstage. The TT2 just gives you a little bit more space for everything to breathe. That's probably part of what makes it easy to listen to, as I just said, and it does produce a slightly greater sense of overall space. Not that it's a whole lot larger in soundstage, there is a little bit more depth, but it just allows, that being the TT2, just allows a tiny bit more separation and definition of each sound. But the thing that I really want to stress here is the difference is minimal. If you've been thinking about something like a TT2, but maybe your budget doesn't stretch there, then I think the Conductor GT is getting you incredibly close, and close enough that some people will listen to both and say there's no difference at all. I personally disagree. I think there is a difference, but whether that difference is worth more than double the price, that's a whole nother question. And indeed for me, if I wasn't looking at having something like a TT2 and an M scaler, if I was only going to get the TT2, I probably would bypass it and go straight for the Conductor GT. And that coming from me is a pretty big statement. I love the Chord products in general. I really enjoy using them. I enjoy their sound. They've always got some little quirks that I don't enjoy in terms of the interface. But sonically, I always enjoy them. And yet on this occasion, if I was only getting the TT2, I would actually choose the Conductor GT. And so when you think about the fact that the Conductor GT, I think is around about the same price as a Chord Hugo 2, maybe a little bit more, but what you're getting is performance that's bordering on TT2 quality for less than half the price of the TT2, and that's pretty astounding. And so at this point, you're probably pretty clear on my conclusions, and that is that the Conductor GT is another absolute hit from Burson. I was really excited when I got to play with a production version of the Soloist GT and see that they'd ironed out all of the wrinkles that made me slightly less of a fan of it in the pre-production unit, and so to see that then translate to an all-in-one that's almost as good as the Soloist GT, almost as good as the Chord Hugo TT2, and at the price that it is in the Conductor GT, and you're getting an insanely good DAC and amplifier for an absolute bargain, relatively speaking. At $3,000 US, it may sound like a lot of money, but when you split that in half and say you're spending, say, $1,500 on the DAC and $1,500 on the amplifier, what you're getting is easily the sum of those parts. Often all-in-ones are a trade-off, but I don't think that's the case with the Conductor GT. It's a wonderful marriage of an outstanding DAC and an outstanding amp that still allows you to feed an external input in, and therefore make it one of the more versatile all-in-ones around. I recently reviewed the FIO K9 Pro ESS, that's a $900 US all-in-one, and the Conductor GT just smashes it to pieces. It doesn't have some of the features, of course, that the FIO does, but in terms of sound quality and power and general performance, it just absolutely smashes it, as it should, for 3 times the price. But my point is, this is an insanely good all-in-one and can absolutely be the only device that some of you ever need. And so if that sounds good to you, I'll put a link down below through to the Burson Audio website where you can read up more, check all the specs, you can buy it if you want to. And I should make it really clear, there's no affiliation, there's no kickbacks or money or sponsorship or anything from Burson. They happen to be local, which is why I often get the first access to some of these products because I'm down the road from them, or a bit more than down the road, but we're in the same state. And so it's purely a case that I'm convenient to them, and I highly respect the work they're doing. They're producing some magnificent products, and I'm always excited to share anything good with all of you. And so as always, I hope you found this review useful. Hopefully I've clarified all your questions about the Conductor GT. If there's anything I've missed answering, do put a comment down below. I'll be glad to jump in and answer it if I can. And of course, if you have found the review useful and you're not yet subscribed, please do consider hitting the subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. It really does help the channel a lot. What's even more helpful is a simple click of the like button if you've enjoyed the video. It'll tell YouTube that it's good content and that others might like it too. So thank you to all of those that have subscribed and that do hit the like button. I deeply appreciate it, and it's helped the channel get to where it is today, which is that I'm getting more and more contacts from other brands offering gear for me to review. And that's really exciting. It means that I can get more great products into my office to listen, play with, and share with you. So thank you to all of you, and for now, let me leave you to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.